rest was just a joke. Karoline laughed, but no one laughed with her. Not the host, not Jasmine, and certainly not the man sitting in the third row. Hands clasped, eyes fixed on her, as if the air around them had frozen. Karoline hadn't noticed him yet she still wore the smile, still trying to brush off the tension, like it was just a minor hiccup in a live broadcast. Jasmine didn't say a word. Her eyes didn't look at Karoline, nor the Jasmine Crockett versus Karoline Levitt heartwarming stories. Camera, they had drifted down to the edge of the table. One finger tapped twice, then stopped. The silence wasn't loud. It was tight, cold, like glass, just thick enough to hold in something that was about to shatter. The audience wasn't angry. Not yet. They were still suspended, caught between the polished stage and a moment that had slipped out of the script, because up until that point, Karoline had been in control. She owned the room. She set the rhythm. Even the moderator leaned slightly in her direction. But then something shifted softly, clearly, as if something sacred had just been touched, and everyone was quietly unsure whether to cover it up or name it aloud. The camera adjusted focus. Someone on the crew raised a hand, but no one understood what the signal was for, and Jasmine still said nothing. But in the third row, an older man in a gray suit, a small pin with 3 stars on his chest, one dimmed, remained motionless. No one mentioned him. No name on the guest list yet. From that moment, every breath he took began to alter the meaning of everything that had just been said. The question was no longer, did Karoline go too far? It had become, did she even know who was sitting in the room? You're watching a conversation no one expected to turn this way, and the real question here isn't who's right or wrong, but whether we can be still enough to hear what hasn't yet been said. Let me know where you're watching from and what you think might happen next. Don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the stories that might just make you pause and see things differently. It was an afternoon crafted to perfection. The talk show American Spotlight was airing live from New York, with a packed audience of over 200 people bathed in lights filled with microphones and laughter, cued exactly where it needed to be. Everything felt familiar, and that's precisely why Karoline felt so confident. She emerged from backstage like a victor. Bright red blazer hair, neatly styled, sharp, eyes and a smile untouched by doubt. She wasn't there to share. She was there to take the stage from the opening lines. Karoline controlled the rhythm. She told stories with just the right pacing, dropped in humor, and knew exactly when to pause so the audience could laugh when the host asked about growing divisions among today's youth. Karoline shrugged. It's simple. Some grow up with values, some just grow up inside a system. The crowd erupted applause, a few nods agreement without hesitation. Jasmine sat beside her in silence, observing. She wore black, a high-collared top. No jewelry. She didn't push back, didn't interrupt, didn't even shift in her seat. The host turned toward her. Jasmine, what do you think of that comment? She answered briefly. That line wasn't meant for me. The room paused just slightly. Karoline smirked as if she'd scored the first point from the beginning. Everything seemed to tilt in Karoline's favor. The cameras framed her more often. The host seemed to echo conservative points. The audience, whether out of curiosity or bias, responded more eagerly each time Karoline spoke. And Karoline knew it. She could feel the wind in her sails. She spoke more faster and began inserting subtle jabs. One's easy to miss, unless you listened closely. I think sometimes people get invited on TV not because they have something worthwhile to say, but because they look like the kind of story media wants to tell. No names were said, but everyone knew who she meant. Jasmine glanced sideways. She still didn't interrupt. She simply placed her pen gently onto the glass table, as if preparing for something Karoline hadn't yet seen coming at that exact moment. For the first time, the camera panned briefly toward the audience and held for less than a second on the third row. No one noticed. Karoline didn't either. Another question came, this time about how the media frames female politicians. The host tossed it quickly, his tone still chasing another laugh. Karoline, have you ever felt misunderstood just for being a woman? She didn't blink. Oh, of course, but I get misunderstood more for not apologizing for what I believe. More applause. A young woman in the audience nodded. A man typed something into his phone, and somewhere someone had started to pause, not because they disagreed, but because something no longer felt quite right. Karoline's confidence began to feel a little colder. Her eyes weren't just focused on the host anymore. They flicked now and then toward Jasmine, as if to check that her silence was still holding. Jasmine stayed silent, but her gaze had drifted out of the studio. It had locked on someone specific. No one paid attention to the man in the third row. No spotlight, no name card. He was simply there in that talk show. Everything had been in its place: the dominant voice, the quiet one, the cameras, the laughter, the script. Everything had gone according to plan, until Karoline said one more line, a line she didn't expect to echo, and then she laughed, confident, thinking she was still in control, unaware that just beneath her a man had lifted his gaze, and from that moment forward the story no longer belonged to her. The host shifted the topic. He asked about representation in modern politics. A familiar subject, but one always laced with mines. Karoline, what do you think about people who say they don't feel heard in today's system? Karoline leaned forward slightly, hands interlaced, and began in a soft tone. I think everyone has the right to feel disadvantaged, but sometimes I wonder if they're truly being left behind, or if the road was paved for them and they just think it's still not enough. A few scattered chuckles followed, not because it was funny, but because a few people felt vindicated. Jasmine furrowed her brow. She looked down at the table, still said nothing. Karoline continued, there are people, I think, who step into politics not because of conviction, but because they fit the moment, fit the campaign, fit the image. Media wants to paint not because they're qualified, but because they're the right color. The last line wasn't delivered as an accusation. It was poured out like a casual observation, light, harmless. Then she laughed softly, as if joking. I mean, I'm just kidding. A faint H echoed from the audience. The host hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. He offered a stiff smile, then turned to Jasmine. Jasmine, would you like to respond to that? Jasmine looked at Karoline for a long moment, but she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she blinked slowly, then turned toward the audience. At that moment, the camera panned down, and for the first time, truly the first time, everyone saw him. The older man is in the third row. His eyes never left Karoline. His back wasn't resting against the chair. His hands were placed calmly on his knees. No extra movements, no visible anger, just silence. A silence sharp enough to be felt. Karoline began to sense something, but didn't yet know what. She let out another short laugh and half joked, half defended. I know I can be blunt sometimes, but I think Americans could stand to be a little less sensitive. This time no one laughed, not a sound, not a shift in the front rows. Jasmine remained still, her eyes fixed not on Karoline, not on the host, but on him, the man in the third row. She looked at him like she was asking, what do I do now? The camera cut back to the host. He looked lost. No one had prepared for this moment. There was no segment in the script for the crowd. Falls completely silent because the joke isn't funny. Karoline exhaled lightly. She was starting to feel it, not because someone challenged her, but because no one did. And it was that silence that made everything tilt. Then Jasmine spoke, but not to Karoline. She said simply, my father is sitting in this room today. The studio collectively turned to the third row. He remained. Still didn't bow his head, didn't nod. Karoline turned too. Her eyes met his. No one could say how long that moment lasted. 3 seconds, 8. But to Karoline it felt like a free fall with nothing to hold on to. And for the first time all evening she said nothing. The host didn't intervene. Maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't. Jasmine placed her hand on the table, not to tap, but to steady something rising inside her. I grew up in a family where my father was asked every single day, where are you from? And when he answered, I was born here, they followed with, no, where are you really from? No one cut in, no applause. No swelling music, just her voice measured clear. And today, when a woman says, I'm only here because I look right, in front of him, maybe you think it's a joke, but to us it's an old wound that never fully healed. Jasmine didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice, she just looked forward. Her tone was steady, each word sinking into the room's silence. Karoline leaned in, perhaps to speak, but the camera no longer focused on her. At that point, the audience was no longer there. To consume content, they had become witnesses not to a debate, but to something greater. A stillness, a question rising inside each of them. If I've ever laughed along because it was just a joke, was I helping keep that wound open? Something had just shifted, not because anyone raised their voice and not because anyone backed down, but because the camera decided to stay. It stayed on the face of the man Karoline was now seeing clearly. For the first time, he sat there unwavering. He didn't avert his eyes. He didn't lean forward. He didn't smile. He wasn't angry. He just looked straight at her. And with that gaze, every justification that had been said, it was just a joke. People are too sensitive. I wasn't talking about anyone specifically. Suddenly, fell hollow, no one had to refute them. They retracted on their own. Karoline's fingers curled slightly around the armrest. She debated congresswomen, faced journalists, and handled protesters, but this was the first time she didn't know where to rest. Her eyes, she glanced toward the host. He was looking down, either reading or avoiding eye contact entirely. The air in the studio had changed, not louder, quieter, so quiet that every movement seemed to carry weight. The gentle tap of Jasmine's pen against the glass table, barely audible, rang out like a knock on a door. No one had dared open. And then he stood up. No warning, no screech of a chair, just a hand on his knee, a slow lean forward. And then he rose calmly. Steadily, the room felt like it had been drained of oxygen. Karoline leaned back just slightly, not out of fear, but she didn't know what reaction was appropriate. He didn't walk toward the stage. He didn't leave. He just stood, hands at his sides. Eyes on Karoline, not condemning, not pleading, but it contained something that demanded to be faced. There were no accusations, none were needed, because his silence, his presence was the loudest thing that had been spoken on that stage. A few in the audience began to shift in their seats. Some glanced at those beside them as if seeking confirmation that they were all feeling the same unspoken thing. An assistant whispered something to the host, maybe about time, maybe about moving on. But no one moved, and the camera stayed his face. Every wrinkle, every streak of gray wasn't stern by design. It simply existed like a mirror, and anyone who looked into it saw themselves. Karoline glanced at Jasmine for the first time in the entire conversation. They were no longer two opponents. Across a line, two women were sitting before a father. And in that brief instant, Karoline thought of her father, not to compare, but to remember. He used to tell her, "Say what's true, even if it's uncomfortable." But he had never taught her to speak the truth without knowing who was listening. And now another father, silent standing, was teaching her that more clearly than any debate ever had the host tried to recover his voice. Uncertain, "We'll now move onto the next part of the program." His words trembled. No one objected, but no one truly heard. Because the image, the man standing in the third row, had become the unshakable center. He hadn't interrupted, hadn't questioned, hadn't judged, but he made the entire room feel that something inside each of them needed to be re-examined. Jasmine placed her hand over her heart, just for a second, then lowered it and turned to Karoline. Her eyes weren't angry nor forgiving. They were simply looking to see if the other could look back. Karoline gave the faintest nod. No one saw it, only she knew she had. And the man in the third row deliberately, quietly sat down. No applause, no sign of relief. Just the stage lights softening, as if even they understood. That moment didn't belong to anyone. It belonged to the truth. And that truth didn't need to be celebrated. It only needed to stand when her father sat back down. Something in the room settled with him. No one asked for silence, but no one had a reason to break it. Karoline leaned back slightly in her chair and said nothing more. The host moved on to the next segment, or at least tried to, but everyone could feel it. The flow of the program no longer belonged to the script, and Jasmine began to speak. "I used to think I understood my father until one day I found out he was once called the educated houseboy, while serving as an officer overseas. No one interrupted. The cameras adjusted their focus on their own. No effects, no scene change. He didn't tell me that story. I overheard it when my mother brought it up during dinner. I remember asking him, 'Why didn't you ever tell me?' And he just said, 'Because I didn't want you to carry bitterness. I wanted you to carry light. A faint exhale came from somewhere in the audience. Someone lowered their head, not out of emotion, but because it felt like a memory they didn't know they shared had just been spoken aloud. Jasmine paused, not with hesitation, but to let the room catch up. I used to think maybe my father was too gentle, maybe he forgave too easily. But when I was 16, I saw him stand at a land policy hearing. He was the only black person in the room, and he didn't tremble. He didn't take back a word. I asked him, "Weren't you afraid?" He laughed and said, "I'm not afraid of their silence, I'm afraid of mine." In that moment, the audience no longer saw Jasmine as a politician. She wasn't trying to persuade anyone, she was simply telling a memory. But in that memory, each detail formed into something larger, an error, and that mirror reflected into the hearts of those who had once thought this was someone else's issue. Karoline turned slightly. Her face wasn't guarded. It wasn't combative for the first time. Her gaze wasn't centered on herself. Jasmine went on. "When I entered politics, my father didn't congratulate me. He just said, 'You won't be undone by the cruel things, you'll be undone by the things people say as if no one's listening.'" And then she looked straight into the camera, but today someone said it was just a joke. But please remember, every joke has an audience, and sometimes that audience is the one who never speaks. A ripple moved through the room, not a sound, just people, shifting, some sitting a bit straighter, others nodding faintly like something long avoided had just been named. And then something strange happened. No one apologized to Jasmine. No one defended Karoline. But something in the room tipped toward Jasmine, not with applause but with a changed perception. For the first time, the host spoke without looking at the teleprompter. "I think sometimes the most important things we say aren't part of any question." Jasmine didn't reply. She just tilted her head, not to confirm, but as if to share the story she had just told equally with everyone in the room, even Karoline. And at that moment, Karoline lowered her head slightly, not to admit guilt, but perhaps to acknowledge there were things she'd never thought about before. Jasmine's father still sat quietly, and for the first time he smiled, not broadly, not tearfully, just enough to show he had heard and seen what was needed to be seen in that moment. The show ceased to be a talk show. It became a more honest version of America. One person said the wrong thing. One person chose not to speak, and one person told a past. So we wouldn't forget. Why are we still here? ChatGPT, John Noibangi, Akwet Tuch, Makong. No one was asked to rise. There was no closing. Music? The host bowed and thanked the guests in a quieter voice than usual. Everyone on set stepped out of something that felt both deeply personal and profoundly shared. And then the video aired. It didn't go viral instantly. No clickbait headlines. No chopped-up edits, just a long, uninterrupted conversation with no winner. And no one was escorted off set. 12 hours later, it was reposted by a journalism student on a small account with a simple caption, "Not because she was strong, but because she spoke of pain without asking anyone to cry for her." Then another post appeared, this time from a white father in Georgia. Underneath the same clip, I used to laugh at the just joking lines. "Now I'm teaching my son to never say that without knowing who's in the room." From there, the video began to spread, not like a scandal, but like a whisper shared again and again through small communities on Reddit. Someone called the moment. Karoline laughed and turned to Jasmine. The instant privilege forgot it wasn't invisible. Another comment simply said, "He stood up and we never saw Karoline the same again." Major news outlets didn't cover it immediately, but one late-night program reserved a full minute of silence, replaying only the moment the man stood, then sat. No narration, no music, no voiceover, just presence at a high school in Chicago. A social studies teacher played the clip. No discussion, no grade. Just one handwritten question was handed out afterward. What makes someone change a room without saying a word? Many students wrote, "Because he was a father." One replied, "Because he didn't apologize, but he also didn't accuse." A Vietnamese-American student wrote, "Because it was the first time I saw a black man not being asked to explain his feelings." Meanwhile, Karoline disappeared from the media. For a few days, not kenneled. Not because she apologized, but because or for the first time she declined interviews. Her team issued a single statement. Karoline is taking time for reflection, and with her family no one knew if it was strategic or sincere. But she didn't call what she said. Taken out of context, she left it where it landed and let it echo. However it would, some said she hadn't changed, others said, if she says nothing else, that might already be changed. Jasmine did not state the show, but 3 days later she posted a photo. Not of herself. It was a candid image taken backstage. Her father was sitting alone after the taping. No phone, no assistant. Just the soft hallway light casting warmth onto his silver hair. Jasmine's caption read, "He didn't need to be believed, he just needed to be seen." The photo didn't make the news, but it was printed and hung in the office of a high school principal in Baltimore. A woman once mocked by students for speaking too softly. She wrote beneath it, I don't need to raise my voice to hold authority. I only need to stay quiet long enough for them to hear the gaps in their words." In a small church in Mississippi, a pastor referenced that exact moment in a Sunday sermon. Faith doesn't come from the one who speaks rightly, but from the one who says nothing and still makes you want to get it right. Even in politics, where every word is polished and weaponized. Some leaders started using the phrase, "Someone stood up." No elaboration needed. Everyone knew who it meant. No party, no label. As for Karoline, so she didn't apologize, but on a later podcast episode when asked, "Is there anything you regret this year?" she paused 3 seconds, then answered, "I wish I'd known a father was sitting in that room, and that not every sentence deserves to become a joke just because I was the first to laugh." No applause followed in the studio, but no one scrolled past either. At a TEDx forum in Oregon, a high school junior took the stage and said, "I don't want to grow up to be the one who's always right. I want to be the one who knows when to stop." Because maybe someone in the room, they have already heard that sentence before, and this time they need to see someone chooses not to keep going. No one declared Jasmine the winner. There were no judges, no lawyers, no scoreboard, just a conversation that came to an end in a room that no longer felt like the one where it began. No one shouted, no one clapped the usual way. People simply stood not to celebrate but to reconsider, to reflect on what they once called just a joke, to remember those who never raised their voice yet. Still made the entire room shift in a candid photo taken from a hallway backstage. Jasmine is seen sitting alone, no phone, no aid. Just her gazing down at the folder she once placed on the table like a quiet admission. No one knows what she was thinking. But the person who took the photo, a freshman journalism student, captioned it, "I used to think strength meant never being wrong. Last night I met someone strong enough to admit she had been the following week." There were no op-eds praising Jasmine, no campaign to elevate her name, just one phrase that began circulating in quiet student forums among law students, educators, and content creators. The line that stopped being said, and quietly, those who used to end jokes, speeches, or segments with "just kidding" began leaving it out. No one told them to. It simply no longer sounded like it belonged in a small bookstore in Atlanta. A photo of the father standing up was printed and taped behind the checkout counter. No caption, no explanation. When asked why she chose that image, the shop owner replied, "Because I want people to fall silent when they see it." A week later, on a different talk show, different channel, another conservative guest began to reach for the familiar punchline about political correctness and the right skin tone. But the host paused, didn't think, just interrupted gently. "Sorry, but we've had a conversation that taught us some things don't belong in the lighthearted section anymore." The guest fell silent and the room shifted. No anger, just the first time someone didn't let it slide. As for Jasmine, she didn't go on a media tour retelling what happened. She didn't post anything new, she just kept doing her work. But something small had changed after each hearing. She began to close her notebook and look directly at every person in the room for 3 seconds before leaving. She never explained why, but anyone who'd been there understood she was leaving space just enough for people to replay their own words in an anonymous internal memo at an education nonprofit. Someone wrote, "Progress doesn't always arrive." With loud rebuttals, sometimes it shows up when someone stops, listens, and chooses not to continue by the second week. Audiences no longer quoted what Karoline had said, but they still remembered the father who stood a 12-year-old in Texas, the child of a migrant worker emailed Jasmine's office. You didn't yell, but I knew you were mad, and so was I. Thank you for not arguing. I think not arguing is the strongest way to protect yourself. And just as the moment seemed to fade into stillness, a new video has leaked behind the scenes before the taping. Jasmine was sitting beside her father. She asked softly, "If I don't say anything, will you be disappointed?" He placed his hand on hers and smiled. "You don't need to say anything at all. Those who are truly listening will hear even the silence. One show, one sentence, one man who stood up, and one woman who outro Black stories." Journal didn't need to win to make an entire room think differently. Where are you watching from? What in this story made you stop scrolling? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe in the quiet strength of presence, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story that's meant to stay with.